Kale's hands moved through the calibration sequence without conscious thought, fingers finding toggles and dials in the dim maintenance corridor where most people needed headlamps to see the panel markings. He didn't. His body had learned the ship's rhythms the way other people learn to walk, by falling first, then adapting, then forgetting there had ever been another way to move. The pressure gauge climbed toward green. He felt the shift in the deck plates beneath his boots, the subtle redistribution of mass as the recycling system cycled through its third phase. Most engineers used instruments to track these changes. Kale just knew. His inner ear registered the fractional tilt. His muscles compensated before his conscious mind acknowledged the adjustment. It had been this way since he was old enough to leave the deep spin nursery. While other children clung to handrails and fought nausea in the transitional corridors, Kyle had simply moved. Effortless, unconscious, a gift he'd never asked for and couldn't refuse. The panel beeped confirmation. He logged the repair in his wrist terminal and moved on. The ship hummed around him, a constant baseline frequency that only residents born aboard could truly hear. Visitors from the supply shuttles, back when shuttles still came, always commented on the noise. They couldn't sleep through it, they said. It was too constant, too pervasive, like living inside a machine's digestive tract. But to Kale, silence would have been the disturbance. The hum was home. The hum was falling. He passed through the junction into Section 7, where gravity lightened by 0.3 standard. His stride lengthened automatically, his breathing shallowed. Other techs would pause here, let their bodies adjust. Kyle kept walking. The observation bay was empty during this shift cycle. He'd timed his route to ensure that. He stopped at the viewport, hands braced against the seal frame, and watched the gas giant rotate beneath the ship's perpetual descent. Amber and rust. Bands of atmospheric pressure that could crush a human body in seconds, swirling in patterns that had fascinated scientists for generations. The ship fell toward it in increments too slow to perceive in a single lifetime, caught in a spiral that would take 3 more centuries to resolve. By then, everyone currently alive would be bones in the recycling system, their carbon redistributed into the hydroponics beds that kept their descendants breathing. Kale came here when the corridors felt too narrow, when the walls seemed to remember his shape from all the times he'd passed through them. When he needed to look at something that didn't need him. The gas giant didn't care about genetic protocols or population viability. It just existed, massive and indifferent, pulling everything toward it with the patient inevitability of physics. He touched the viewport glass, cool, smooth, the only barrier between him and vacuum, but it felt solid enough, permanent enough, more permanent than anything the council promised. "You're avoiding your schedule again." Kyle didn't turn. He recognized Maren's voice, recognized the careful distance she maintained when approaching him in empty spaces. She'd learned not to startle him, learned that he tracked movement the way predators tracked prey, by instinct, by the subtle disturbances in air pressure and sound. Equipment needed repair, he said. Which was true, it was always true. The ship was 3 generations old and falling. Everything needed repair. Maren moved to stand beside him, not quite touching, her reflection ghosting across the viewport glass. She wore her council liaison uniform, functional gray that did nothing to soften her frame or hide the tension in her shoulders. She was tired. They were all tired. 3 generations of falling did that to people. "They've scheduled you for processing tomorrow," she said. "Midday cycle. Section 4 medical. I have deep spin maintenance scheduled. They've reassigned it." Kale's hands tightened against the viewport frame. The metal creaked slightly under the pressure. Maren noticed. She always noticed. "It's not a request anymore," she continued, her voice quieter now. "The emergency provision is active. The council has the authority." "I know what they have." "Then why are you making this harder than it needs to be?" Kyle turned to face her. She met his eyes without flinching, which was more than most council representatives managed. Maren had always been like that, direct, unflinching, honest even when honesty hurt. It was probably why they kept sending her. "Because once I comply," he said, "they'll expect everyone else to comply, and the protocol stops being voluntary." "It stopped being voluntary when we fell below genetic diversity thresholds. That's not the same thing as consent." Maren's jaw tightened. For a moment she looked like she wanted to argue. Then the tension blared out of her shoulders and she just looked tired again. I'm not your enemy, Kyle. I know. Then help me help you. Please. The word hung between them, heavy with everything she wasn't saying. Maren never said please. Council liaisons didn't beg. They persuaded, negotiated, applied pressure through carefully calibrated techniques designed to make compliance feel like choice. But this wasn't technique. This was exhaustion. This was someone caught between her own doubts and the machinery of survival, asking him to make her job easier. Kyle looked at her. Really looked. The shadows under her eyes. The way her hands stayed carefully at her sides, not reaching for him even though he could see the urge in her posture. She wanted to touch him, wanted the intimacy of contact to soften the transaction they were negotiating. He took a step back. Maren's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or resignation. Tomorrow, she said. Midday, Section 4. She left without waiting for his response. Kyle turned back to the viewport. The gas giant continued its slow rotation, indifferent and eternal. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass and felt the ship's hum through his skull. Tomorrow. They'd been saying tomorrow for months now. Every time he found a reason to delay, they rescheduled. Every time he rescheduled, they applied more pressure. Eventually, the pressure would become force. Eventually, he would have to choose between resistance and survival. But not tonight. Tonight, he still had time. Tonight, the ship was still falling and he was still whole, and the protocol was still something that happened to other people. He stayed at the viewport until the shift cycle changed and the corridors began to fill with movement. Then he slipped back into the maintenance network, into the spaces between walls where only people with his particular adaptations could navigate, and disappeared. The deep spin compartment smelled different from the rest of the ship, warmer, more humid. Gravity pressed down with something close to Earth normal weight, making Kale's muscles work harder just to stand still. People who lived here full-time developed a particular kind of body, heavier, denser, stronger in ways that became liability in zero-G. Kyle could feel the difference in his own frame after just an hour. His breathing deepened. His heart rate increased to compensate for the additional pressure. Most people experience deep spin like walking through water. Kyle experienced it like coming home to a place he'd never actually lived. He found Orin in the engine maintenance sub-level, 3 floors below residential, where the temperature climbed another 10 degrees and the air tasted like metal and recycled sweat. The engineer was elbow-deep in a coolant manifold, his shirt discarded somewhere in the shadows, skin gleaming with condensation. "Thought you were avoiding council assignments," Orin said without looking up. "This isn't council. This is maintenance. Everything's council now." Orin withdrew his arm from the manifold, wiping lubricant on his pants. "Hand me the torque wrench." Kyle retrieved the tool from the scattered kit and passed it over. Their fingers didn't touch. Orin was careful about that. Careful about maintaining exactly enough distance to keep things professional while still letting Kale feel the deliberate space between them. They'd worked together for 2 years. Long enough for Kale to learn Orin's rhythms, the way his shoulders tensed before he asked difficult questions, the particular silence that meant he was choosing words carefully. Long enough for Orin to learn that Kale didn't respond to pressure the way most people did, that pushing him only made him retreat further into himself. "They're talking about escalation," Orin said, attention focused on the manifold seal. "Council session yesterday." Maren tried to argue for extension, but she was outvoted. "How do you know that?" "Because I was there. They wanted engineering perspective on containment protocols." Kyle went still. Containment. If you don't comply voluntarily, they need contingency plans. Restricted movement, supervised quarters. They're calling it protective custody. The torque wrench slipped in Orin's grip. He swore, adjusted his angle, tried again. The seal tightened with a pneumatic hiss. Kale leaned against the bulkhead, feeling the vibration of the ship's systems through his spine. Containment. They were going to lock him up, turn his body into something managed, controlled, extracted. The protocol had always been about genetic material, but now it was also about precedent, about proving that resistance was temporary, that eventually the ship's needs would override individual choice. "There's another option," Orin said quietly. "I'm listening." Orin set down the wrench and turned to face him. In the dim maintenance lighting, his features were all shadows and angles, eyes dark and unreadable. Comply partially. Donate genetic material under negotiated terms. You maintain autonomy. They get what they need for the breeding program and everyone moves on. That's not autonomy. That's surrender. It's compromise. It's compliance with better marketing. Orin's jaw tightened. He moved closer, close enough that Cale could feel the heat radiating off his skin, smell the sharp tang of exertion and machine oil, close enough that when Orin spoke, his breath ghosted across Cale's collarbone. You think I don't understand what they're asking you to give up? Orin's voice was low, rough-edged. You think I haven't been through the protocol evaluations myself? Kyle met his eyes. You complied. I chose. The distinction seemed important to Orin. His hand came up, not quite touching Cale's shoulder, hovering in the space between contact and intention. I chose because fighting them would have cost me everything I'd built here, my work, my access, my ability to fix the things that keep us alive. I chose the terms I could live with. And do you live with them? Orin's hand fell away. He turned back to the manifold, shoulders tight with something that might have been anger or shame or just exhaustion. Most days. They worked in silence after that, Kyle handing tools and holding components while Orin recalibrated the coolant flow. The rhythm was familiar, practiced, the kind of wordless coordination that came from spending hours in close quarters with someone who understood the work. But the silence felt different now, weighted with everything Orin had admitted and everything Kyle couldn't say in return. When the repair was finished, Orin wiped his hands on a rag and looked at Kyle with something too complicated to name. They're not going to stop, he said. You know that, right? They can't afford to, not with the projections showing genetic collapse in 4 generations. I know. Then what's the plan? Keep running until they force you? Because they will force you. And when they do, you won't have any terms left to negotiate. Kyle picked up the discarded tools, returning them to the kit with precise, deliberate movements. His hands needed something to do, something that wasn't reaching for Orin, or pushing him away, or doing any of the things that would make this conversation more complicated than it already was. The plan, he said finally, is to make them regret needing me in the first place. Orin studied him for a long moment. Then he pulled his shirt back on, movements slow and careful like he was dressing a wound. That's not a plan, that's spite. It's what I have. Orin shook his head, but there was something almost like respect in his expression. Or maybe just recognition of someone else who understood what it meant to protect the last small territory of choice in a world that had stopped offering options. Midday tomorrow, Orin said. Section 4, Medical. If you don't show, they're authorized to use force. I know. Cale, I know. Orin nodded slowly. Then he gathered his tools and left, footsteps heavy in the artificial gravity, leaving Cale alone with the humming machinery and the weight of tomorrow pressing down like the deep-spin compartments pressing down, inevitable and inescapable. Kyle stayed until his shift cycle ended. Then he climbed back through the maintenance network to the mid-spin residential levels, where gravity lightened and breathing came easier, and the walls didn't feel quite so much like a cage. But the weight followed him anyway. The hydroponics bay existed in its own microclimate, humid, oxygen-rich, smelling of soil and green things, and the particular sweetness of plants converting carbon dioxide into breathable air. It was one of the few places on the ship that felt alive in a way that had nothing to do with machinery. Cale came here when the metal corridors made his skin crawl, when he needed to touch something organic, when he needed to remember that survival wasn't just about systems and protocols, but about growing things patiently, day by day, until they became something that could sustain life. He found Maren near the tomato vines, her hands working through the tangle of stems and leaves with practiced efficiency. She'd removed her council jacket, working in just an undershirt that showed the lean muscle of her arms, the particular strength that came from hours of manual labor rather than gym-standard conditioning. She didn't look up when he approached, just kept working, fingers gentle on the delicate vine structures. I missed my appointment, Kyle said. I noticed. They'll send someone. They already did. I volunteered. Kyle moved to the adjacent planting bed, picking up pruning shears from the tool rack. The vines needed trimming. They always needed trimming. Growth in hydroponics was aggressive, hungry, consuming every available resource to push toward the artificial lights. They worked in parallel silence for several minutes. Cale cut away dead leaves, removed sucker shoots, guided the main vines back toward their support structures. Maren harvested ripe tomatoes, placing them carefully in a collection basket. "This doesn't count as protective custody," she said eventually. "What does it count as?" "Conversation. The council doesn't pay you for conversation." Maren set down the basket and turned to face him. Her hands were stained with chlorophyll and tomato juice, fingernails rimmed with soil. She looked more human like this, less like a council liaison, and more like someone who understood what it meant to grow things in the dark. "The council doesn't pay me enough for any of this," she said, "but I do it anyway because someone has to bridge the gap between survival and humanity. Which side am I on? You tell me." Kyle trimmed another sucker shoot, the scissors making a clean snick through green flesh. "I'm on the side that says my body belongs to me. And when your body is the only thing standing between genetic collapse and viable population continuation? Still mine." Maren picked up the basket again, but didn't return to harvesting. She stood there, holding tomatoes, looking at Kale with an expression he couldn't quite pass. "Do you know why I volunteered for this?" she asked. "To convince me to comply. To make sure that when they force you, it's someone who'll minimize the damage." The pruning shears stilled in Kyle's hand. He looked at her properly, saw the exhaustion in her posture, the way her fingers gripped the basket edge too tightly, the shadows under her eyes that had deepened since their last conversation. "They're going to force me regardless," he said. "Yes. So what difference does it make who delivers the ultimatum?" Maren set the basket down carefully. She moved closer, not quite entering his personal space, but near enough that he could smell the green scent of tomato leaves on her skin. "Because I'll fight for negotiated terms, limited extraction, consent for each procedure, autonomy over implementation. The others won't. The others will just process you like equipment and call it civic duty. And you think that's better? I think it's the difference between violation and compromise. I think it matters." Kyle wanted to argue, wanted to say that compromise was just violation with paperwork. But the way Maren looked at him, like she was asking for permission to protect him even though she didn't need his permission, even though the council had already authorized whatever came next, made the argument die in his throat. "What are the terms?" he asked. Relief flickered across Maren's face, subtle but unmistakable. "Monthly donations, medical supervision, genetic material stored and distributed according to compatibility protocols. You maintain standard residential privileges, work assignments, movement freedom. And if I refuse? Protective custody, daily extraction, supervised quarters, restricted access to ship systems. Prison, in other words, imprisonment with a humanitarian veneer." Kyle turned back to the tomato vines, shears moving through dead growth with mechanical precision. Maren waited, patient as the plants themselves, while he processed what she was offering. It wasn't choice, not really. But it was the illusion of choice, which might be the closest thing to freedom left on a falling ship, where survival had become the only moral imperative. "I need to think about it," he said. "You have until end of shift cycle. After that, the council votes on custody protocols. That's 4 hours." "I know." Maren picked up her basket and moved to the next section of vines. They worked without speaking for the remainder of the hour, the only sounds the snip of shears and the rustle of leaves, and the ever-present ship hum underneath everything. When Kale finally left the hydroponics bay, Maren was still harvesting. He looked back once and found her watching him, her expression unreadable in the green-filtered light. He didn't know if what he felt was gratitude or resentment, or something more complicated that lived in the space between both. But he knew he had 4 hours to decide whether to surrender on negotiated terms or force them to take what they wanted by violence. 4 hours to choose which version of violation he could live with. Kyle spent the first hour in the observation bay, watching the gas giant rotate beneath the viewport. The amber and rust bands moved with glacial slowness, storm systems the size of planets churning through atmospheric layers that would annihilate human flesh in microseconds. The ship fell toward it, always falling, never quite arriving. He pressed his palm flat against the viewport glass and felt the cold seep through his skin. Somewhere beyond this barrier was vacuum. Somewhere beyond that was a gravity well that had been pulling them downward for 3 generations. His grandparents' had watched this same view, had felt this same cold, had made their own calculations about what they could control and what they could only endure. They'd chosen endurance. They'd built the protocol and convinced themselves it was voluntary, because the alternative was admitting they'd turned survival into a system that consumed people. Kyle's reflection stared back at him from the glass, translucent and ghostly. Behind it, the gas giant churned, falling and watching himself fall, trapped between the ship and the void, between compliance and resistance, between who he'd been and who the Council needed him to become. The second hour, he spent in the deep spin maintenance sub-level where he'd last talked to Orin. The compartment was empty now, the coolant manifold sealed and functioning, temperature still running 10 degrees hot. Kyle stripped off his shirt and sat with his back against the bulkhead, feeling the ship's systems vibrate through metal into bone. Orin had complied, had chosen the terms he could live with, sacrificed the autonomy he couldn't protect, made peace with being a resource instead of just a person, and he functioned. Still did his work, still fixed the things that needed fixing, still found ways to be human in the spaces between protocols. Most days, he'd said, most days he lived with it, which meant some days he didn't. Kyle wondered what those days looked like, whether Orin came here to the hot maintenance compartments and sat against bulkheads and felt the weight of his choices vibrating through him, whether he'd ever regretted compliance or if regret was just another luxury they couldn't afford on a falling ship. The third hour Kyle spent in his quarters, standard residential unit, sleeping berth, storage compartment, small desk with terminal access, hygiene alcove, 40 square meters of personal space that felt smaller every year. He lay on the sleeping berth and stared at the ceiling, counting the hairline fractures in the metal plating overhead, 17 visible cracks, structural fatigue from 3 generations of stress and shifting gravity. The ship was falling apart slowly, the same way people were falling apart, the same way choice was falling apart under the grinding pressure of survival. He thought about tomorrow, about walking into Section 4 medical and lying down on an examination table and letting them extract pieces of him, about the feel of sterile equipment and clinical lighting and Marin standing somewhere nearby, making sure they followed negotiated terms, making sure violation came with consent forms and medical supervision. He thought about the day after tomorrow, and the day after that, each month marked by extraction, by the slow conversion of his body from person to resource to genetic material distributed among strangers. He thought about protective custody, about supervised quarters and restricted movement, and the walls closing in until there was nothing left of himself that they didn't control. Neither option felt like living. Both felt like different kinds of dying. The fourth hour he spent walking, through the ship's corridors, through sections that shifted gravity beneath his feet, through spaces where his body knew how to move, even when his mind couldn't find solid ground. He walked past residential quarters, where families lived in careful harmony with protocol schedules, past workstations, where people maintained the systems that kept them all alive, past the hydroponics bay where Marin was probably still harvesting, hands stained green, fighting her own battles with the impossible mathematics of survival. He walked until the shift cycle changed, and the corridors filled with movement, and his terminal chimed with an incoming message. Council chambers. Immediate attendance required. Kyle stopped walking. Around him, people flowed through their routines, faces he recognized from years of coexistence on a ship that had never been big enough for privacy or small enough for intimacy. They knew him, knew what the Council wanted from him, knew that his resistance had become a public measure of whether the protocol was truly voluntary or just politely mandatory. Some of them looked at him with sympathy, some with resentment. Some just looked away, uncomfortable with the reminder that their own compliance had been purchased with the promise that it would never become forced. Kyle pulled his shirt back on and headed toward council chambers. The meeting room was smaller than he'd expected. Circular table, 7 seats, minimal decoration except for a viewport showing the eternal gas giant backdrop. 5 council members were already seated. Marin stood against the wall, her liaison jacket back on, expression carefully neutral. Kyle, the council chair, an older woman named Veris, whose family had been scientists on the original station, gestured to an empty seat. "Thank you for coming." He remained standing. Veris didn't push. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him with the kind of patient exhaustion that came from making impossible decisions for too long. "We've reviewed your situation," she said. "Marin has advocated for negotiated compliance. Several council members support this approach. However, we need your formal agreement before we can proceed. And if I don't agree, then we invoke protective custody under emergency provision clauses. You'll be transferred to supervised quarters immediately." Kyle looked at Myron. She met his eyes but didn't speak, didn't plead or persuade or make promises she couldn't keep. Just stood there letting him see that she'd done everything she could within the system's constraints. "The negotiated terms," Kyle said. "I want them in writing. I want medical oversight from someone outside the council. I want the right to refuse specific procedures if they pose health risks." Varys glanced at the other council members. Silent communication passed between them. Calculations, cost-benefit analyses, political considerations Kyle couldn't read and didn't care to learn. "Agreed," Varys said finally, "with the provision that refusals based on health concerns require independent medical evaluation." "Agreed. Then we have terms." Kyle felt something shift inside him. Not relief, not resignation. Something more like acknowledgement that he'd been falling all along and had just now hit the point where falling became inevitable descent. "First extraction is scheduled for tomorrow morning," Varys continued. "Section 4, Medical. Marin will accompany you to ensure protocol compliance." Kyle nodded. Didn't trust his voice to stay steady if he tried to speak. The council members began gathering their materials. The meeting concluded. Marin moved toward him, but Kyle left before she could say whatever comfort she was preparing to offer. He walked back through the corridors to his quarters, sealed the door behind him, and sat on his sleeping berth in the dark. Tomorrow, he would surrender. Tomorrow, the protocol would stop being something that happened to other people and become something that happened to him. Tomorrow, his body would start converting from person to resource, choice by negotiated choice, until the distinction didn't matter anymore. But tonight he was still whole. Tonight he could still feel the ship falling around him and know that some part of him, some small, stubborn part, was choosing which way to face the descent. He lay back and stared at the 17 cracks in the ceiling until the artificial night cycle ended and the lights came up and tomorrow became now. The medical facility smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, sterile in ways that made Kyle's skin crawl. He'd been in Section 4 medical before, routine health screenings, work injury treatments, the occasional vaccination when new genetic material entered the ship's population pool. But this felt different. This felt like crossing a threshold he couldn't uncross. Marin walked beside him, close but not touching. Her presence both reassurance and reminder that this was happening whether he was ready or not. The examination room was small. Single table, monitoring equipment, storage cabinet, privacy screen. A medical technician Kyle didn't recognize was setting up instruments with practiced efficiency. "Dr. Chen will be supervising," Marin said quietly. "She's not council-affiliated." "I vetted her myself," Kyle nodded. Tried to find words for the gratitude he felt that Marin had bothered, that she'd spent political capital making sure his violation came with safeguards. But the words stuck somewhere in his throat, tangled up with resentment and resignation, and the particular helplessness of choosing the least terrible option. Dr. Chen entered, a woman in her 50s, gray-haired and efficient-looking, carrying a data tablet. She glanced at Kale, then at Marin, then back to Kale. "I've reviewed the negotiated terms," she said without preamble. "Standard extraction protocol, genetic material preservation. You have the right to refuse any procedure you deem medically unsound, subject to my independent evaluation. Understood?" "Understood. Then let's begin. Please disrobe from the waist down and have a seat on the examination table." The clinical language helped somehow. Made it feel more like a medical procedure and less like the systematic conversion of his autonomy into biological material. Kyle complied, movements mechanical, while Marin turned toward the privacy screen and Dr. Chen prepared her equipment. The extraction itself was quick, professional. Dr. Chen worked with the kind of practiced efficiency that made the whole thing feel routine, unremarkable, just another medical procedure in a life full of medical procedures. Kyle focused on the ceiling, counting the ventilation grills, breathing through the discomfort and the deeper violation that had nothing to do with physical sensation. When it was finished, Dr. Chen labeled the samples, logged the data, and looked at Kale with something that might have been sympathy. "You can get dressed. I'll schedule your next appointment for 4 weeks from now. If you experience any complications, contact me directly." Kale dressed in silence. Maren waited by the door, her expression carefully neutral, giving him space to process whatever he needed to process without her witnessing it. They walked back through the corridors together. Maren didn't try to make conversation, didn't offer platitudes or reassurances, just walked beside him, maintaining that careful distance until they reached his residential section. "Are you—" she started. "I'm fine." "Kale?" "I'm fine." Maren looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, accepting the lie because sometimes lies were the only privacy people had left. "I'll submit the compliance report to the council. You're cleared for normal work assignments and residential privileges." "Thank you." The words came out more sincere than Kale had intended. Maren's expression softened slightly, some of the professional distance falling away to reveal the exhaustion underneath. "I know this isn't what you wanted," she said quietly. "I know it doesn't feel like choice, but you're still here, you're still yourself, that matters." Kyle wanted to believe her, wanted to think that compliance with negotiated terms was different enough from forced extraction to count as agency, but all he felt was hollow, emptied out, like he'd traded pieces of himself for the illusion of autonomy and couldn't quite remember why that had seemed like the better option. "I should get to work," he said. Maren nodded, hesitated. Then she reached out and touched his arm, brief, gentle, a contact that asked nothing and offered only the reminder that she was still there, still fighting her own battles with the systems they both served. Then she left, and Kyle was alone with the weight of what he'd agreed to, and the knowledge that 4 weeks from now he'd do it again. The days developed a rhythm: wake, work, maintain, sleep. Kyle moved through ship systems with the same unconscious grace, his body adapting to shifting gravity while his mind tried to adapt to the new architecture of his life. He saw Myron occasionally in the corridors, in the hydroponics bay, once in the observation deck during a rest cycle. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. She'd check his wrist terminal logs, verify his work assignments, make sure he was maintaining his negotiated freedoms. He'd nod, confirm, go back to fixing things. The second extraction came 4 weeks later, then the third. Each time, Dr. Chen's professional efficiency. Each time, Maren's careful presence. Each time, Kyle counted ceiling tiles and breathed through the clinical violation and told himself this was different from protective custody. This mattered. This was choice. But the distinction felt thinner each time. Orin found him in the deep spin maintenance sub-level 6 weeks after the first extraction. Kyle was recalibrating a gravity stabilizer, hands deep in the mechanism, sweat dripping despite the cooler temperature in this section. "You've been avoiding me," Orin said. "I've been working." "You're always working, that's not the same as avoiding." Kyle pulled his hands free and wiped them on his pants. Orin looked the same, solid, practical, frustratingly perceptive. He held out a water bottle, and Kale took it, grateful for the excuse not to meet his eyes. "How are you handling it?" Orin asked. "Fine." "That's not what I asked." Kale drank half the water, buying time to figure out what answer Orin was looking for. What answer was true, whether there was any difference between the two. "I'm complying," he said finally. "That's what matters. Compliance isn't the same as handling it. It's all they require." Orin moved closer, settling onto the deck plates beside Kale with the heavy grace of someone comfortable in deep spin gravity. Close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Close enough that Kale could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "I told you I live with it most days," Orin said quietly. "You want to know what the other days look like?" Kale didn't answer. Wasn't sure he wanted to know. But Orin continued anyway. "The other days I wake up and remember that I bargained away something fundamental, that I chose terms I could survive, but not terms I could accept. And I have to make peace with that all over again, every time, until it stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like just another system I'm trapped in. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know what you're actually agreeing to, not just the extraction schedule, not just the medical procedures, the slow erosion of the boundary between compliance and capitulation." Kyle set down the water bottle, stared at his hands, calloused from maintenance work, stained with machine grease. Still his own, even if what they touched and fixed and maintained was all in service of a ship that had stopped asking what he wanted. "Does it get easier?" he asked. "No. But you get better at carrying it." They sat in silence for a while, shoulders not quite touching, both carrying weight neither had chosen, but both had learned to bear. Eventually Orin stood, offered Kyle a hand up. Their palms pressed together, warm, solid, briefly grounding. "The crew meal is tonight," Orin said. "You should come." "I'm not hungry." "I didn't say you were. I said you should come." Kyle looked at him, saw the invitation behind the words. The reminder that compliance didn't have to mean isolation, that he could still be part of something larger than his own resistance. "Maybe," he said. Orin smiled, small, real, the first genuine expression Kyle had seen from him in weeks. Then he left, footsteps heavy in the artificial gravity, leaving Kyle alone with the stabilizer, and the knowledge that survival came in small pieces. And sometimes those pieces looked like crew meals and water bottles, and someone who understood what it meant to carry something you couldn't put down. The crew meal happened once a month in the communal dining hall, a space large enough to hold 200 people, though the ship's current population hovered around 150. Long tables, shared food prepared from hydroponics harvest, the kind of forced community that emerged when humans lived in enclosed spaces with no escape routes. Kyle arrived late, after most people had already seated themselves. He scanned the room, looking for empty spaces, finding Orin at a corner table with several other engineers. Merrin sat 2 tables over with the council liaisons, her attention focused on a conversation Kyle couldn't hear. He collected food, tomato-based stew, fresh bread from the grain harvest, water, and moved toward Orin's table. The engineers made space for him without comment, continuing their discussion about coolant system inefficiencies. The food was better than standard rations. Hydroponics harvest always tasted more alive somehow, less processed, carrying the green essence of growing things. Kyle ate slowly, letting the engineer's conversation wash over him, grateful for the normalcy of technical problems and practical solutions. "Kyle." He looked up. Merrin stood beside the table, holding her own meal tray, looking uncertain in a way that didn't fit her usual competence. "Mind if I join you?" The engineers exchanged glances. Orin's expression remained carefully neutral, but something shifted in his posture. Awareness, maybe, or recognition that this was more complicated than table politics. "Sure," Kyle said. Merrin settled into the space beside him, close but not invasive, her presence drawing attention from several nearby tables. Council liaisons didn't typically sit with general crew. The separation was unofficial, but understood. A social distance that matched the political distance between those who enforced protocols and those who lived under them. "How's the stew?" she asked. "Good. Tomatoes are ripe this cycle. I noticed. We harvested twice as much as projected. The new lighting system is working. Your calibrations helped." They fell into silence. Around them, the dining hall hummed with conversation, laughter, the particular sound of people finding comfort in shared meals and familiar faces. Kyle finished his bread, aware of Merrin's proximity, aware of the engineers watching without watching, aware that something about this felt significant even if he couldn't name exactly what. "Can I ask you something?" Merrin said quietly. "Depends what it is." "The extractions. Are they... Is Dr. Chen following the terms?" Kyle looked at her. Really looked. Saw the worry in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped her water glass too tightly. "She is." "And you're handling it?" The question hit deeper than she probably intended. Handling it. As if compliance was just a matter of endurance, as if surviving the protocol was the same as accepting it. "Most days," he said, echoing Orin's language without meaning to. Understanding flickered across Merrin's face. She'd heard those words before. Knew what they meant. Knew that most days implied some days where handling it wasn't possible, where the weight became too much and survival felt like the slowest kind of drowning. Her hand moved across the table, stopping just short of his. Not touching, but close enough that the intention was clear. Close enough that Kyle could feel the warmth of her skin, the slight tremor in her fingers that betrayed nerves she usually hid better. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know that doesn't change anything. I know I'm still part of the system that's doing this to you, but I'm sorry anyway." Kale stared at the small gap between their hands, thought about closing it, thought about what that contact would mean. Forgiveness, maybe, or acknowledgement that they were both trapped in systems neither had designed. Or maybe just the simple human need for connection, in a place where connection had become complicated by protocols and power dynamics, and the slow erosion of what counted as choice. He didn't close the gap, but he didn't pull away either. "Thank you for fighting for terms," he said instead. "It matters. Even when it doesn't feel like it matters, it does." Maren's eyes brightened with something that might have been tears, though she blinked them back before they could fall. She nodded, withdrew her hand, returned to eating her stew with careful attention. They stayed like that through the rest of the meal, not quite touching, not quite separate, existing in the liminal space between antagonism and alliance, while the ship fell around them and the crew ate and laughed and pretended that survival was enough. When the meal ended, Maren helped clear tables. Kale found himself working beside her, their movements developing the same unconscious coordination that came from shared labor. Loading trays, wiping surfaces, resetting the dining hall for tomorrow's breakfast shift. They worked until the hall was empty except for them. Then Maren stopped, hands braced against a table edge, and looked at Kyle with an expression too raw to be anything but honest. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "How to be part of the system that hurts you and still be someone you can trust. I don't know either. But you're here. You came to the crew meal. You let me sit with you. That's not trust. That's just not refusing. Maybe that's all we get on a falling ship." Kyle considered that. Considered that trust might be a luxury they couldn't afford, that maybe the best they could manage was not refusing, not retreating, not giving up on the possibility that they could be human to each other, even inside systems that treated them as resources. "Maybe," he agreed. Maren smiled, sad, exhausted, real. Then she left, and Kale finished cleaning alone, finding something almost meditative in the simple work of maintaining order in a world that felt increasingly disordered. When he finally returned to his quarters, he found a message on his terminal, from Maren, just 3 words, "Thank you for staying." He stared at the message for a long time before deleting it, but he didn't delete the feeling it left behind. 3 months into the extraction protocol, Kyle noticed the first crack, not in the ship's structure. Those had always been there, hairline fractures spreading slowly through metal and composite materials under the constant stress of falling. This crack was in himself, in the careful distance he maintained between compliance and acceptance, in the boundary between what they took and what he gave. The extraction had become routine, Dr. Chen's efficiency, Maren's presence. The ceiling tiles he counted to distract himself from the clinical violation. He'd learned to disassociate during the procedures, to let his mind drift while his body provided what the protocol required. But routine had a cost. Each month it became slightly easier to walk into Section 4 Medical, slightly easier to comply without resistance, slightly easier to forget that this wasn't normal, wasn't acceptable, was just survivable. And that ease terrified him more than the extractions themselves. He was in the observation bay when the realization hit, watching the gas giant's eternal rotation, hands pressed against viewport glass. The same position he'd been in 4 months ago when Maren had delivered the Council's ultimatum. 4 months, 12 weeks, 3 extractions, each one a small surrender, each one a reminder that resistance had limits, and those limits looked like protected custody or negotiated compliance, or just slow capitulation, to systems that didn't care whether you agreed, as long as you obeyed. His reflection stared back from the glass, translucent, ghostly, falling alongside the ship into a gravity well that would take centuries to resolve. He looked the same, still moved with unconscious grace, still adapted to shifting gravity without thought, still fixed systems and maintained equipment and functioned, but something essential had changed. Some boundary he'd thought was fixed had started to blur. "You're thinking too hard." Kale turned. Orin stood in the bay entrance, tool belt slung over one shoulder, looking tired but solid in the way people looked when they'd made peace with carrying weight. "Someone has to," Kyle said. "Doesn't have to be you." Orin moved to stand beside him, mirroring his position at the viewport. They stood in parallel silence, watching amber and rust bands swirl through alien atmosphere, both falling in their own ways. "I'm losing the distinction," Kyle said quietly. Between what I'm choosing and what they're making me choose. Orin didn't answer immediately, just breathed. Watched the gas giant. Let the ship's hum fill the space between them. That's the cost, he said finally. Not the extractions themselves, the way compliance erodes the boundaries you thought were absolute. The way surviving becomes accepting becomes forgetting you used to fight. How do you live with that? Badly. Some days. Cale looked at him. Saw the exhaustion in Orin's eyes, the particular weariness that came from carrying something too heavy for too long. Saw recognition there too. Someone else who understood what it meant to negotiate with your own erosion. Does it help? Kyle asked. Talking about it? Depends who's listening. I'm listening. Something shifted in Orin's expression. He turned from the viewport to face Kyle fully, close enough that the warm air between them felt charged with something more than proximity. I complied 3 years ago, Orin said. First extraction, I told myself it was practical. Second, I told myself it was civic duty. Third, I stopped telling myself anything because the stories didn't matter anymore. I was just doing it, month after month. Until one day I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd actually chosen something, instead of just accepting what was inevitable. His hand came up, almost touching Cale's shoulder, hovering in that space between intention and contact. You asked me once if I live with it, Orin continued. The truth is I survive it, most days. But living with it, that requires something I'm not sure I still have. Kyle understood then, really understood, what Orin was offering. Not reassurance, not comfort, just honest witness to what compliance cost, what survival looked like when you stripped away the rationalizations and just faced the daily weight of carrying your own capitulation. He reached up and caught Orin's hand, pulled it down to rest solid and warm against his shoulder. Let the contact ground them both. Thank you, Kyle said. For what? Not lying to me. Orin's fingers tightened against his shoulder. Then he pulled Cale into an embrace, brief, fierce, the kind of contact that had nothing to do with desire, and everything to do with two people recognizing each other's weight and choosing to hold it together, if only for a moment. When they separated, Orin's eyes were bright. He cleared his throat, stepped back, adjusted his tool belt with hands that weren't quite steady. Shift cycle's ending soon, he said. Are you working tomorrow? Always. Deep spin maintenance needs an extra set of hands. Join me? Kyle nodded, watched Orin leave, turned back to the viewport and his translucent reflection and the endless falling that was both literal and metaphorical and somehow against all logic still survivable. The fifth extraction was different. Kyle knew it the moment he walked into Section 4 Medical and saw Dr. Chen's expression, worried, careful, like she was about to deliver news that would hurt but couldn't be avoided. What is it? He asked. Dr. Chen glanced at Maren, who stood by the privacy screen looking equally concerned. Then she pulled up data on her tablet and showed him. Your hormone levels are showing stress indicators, she said. Elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep patterns, increased baseline anxiety. None of it is immediately dangerous, but it's trending in a concerning direction. I'm fine. You're complying. That's not the same as fine. The distinction sounded uncomfortably familiar. Kyle took the tablet, studied the graphs and data points that apparently represented his body's response to systematic extraction. The numbers meant nothing to him, just abstract markers of stress he didn't consciously feel. What does this mean for the protocol? He asked. It means we need to monitor you more closely, potentially adjust the extraction schedule if the stress indicators worsen. The Council won't agree to that. Dr. Chen's expression hardened. The Council doesn't have final say over medical decisions. I do. And if continuing the current schedule poses health risks, we'll adjust it. Maren moved closer, her presence both comfort and complication. Kyle, if you need a break, I don't need a break. I need this to be over. The words came out harsher than intended. Maren flinched slightly but didn't retreat. It won't be over, she said quietly. Not for years. You know that. Kyle did know. The protocol was designed for long-term genetic preservation, for decades of systematic extraction from viable donors, for slow, careful distribution of genetic material until population stability was achieved, or the ship's descent resolved into either escape or annihilation. Years, potentially decades, of monthly extractions, of boundaries eroding, of surviving and complying and forgetting what it felt like to own his own body without qualification. He handed the tablet back to Dr. Chen. "Do the extraction. Kyle, do it." Dr. Chen studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded, professional mask sliding back into place, and began preparing her equipment. The extraction proceeded normally. Kyle counted ceiling tiles, breathed through the procedure, disassociated into the safe distance where his body was just meat and bone performing, required functions, while his mind floated somewhere above it all. When it was finished, he dressed quickly, movements mechanical. Maren tried to talk to him, but he pushed past her out of the medical facility, into the corridors where at least he could move. He walked without destination, through sections, past viewports showing the eternal gas giant. Through gravity shifts his body navigated without conscious thought, walked until his legs burned and his breathing came ragged and the physical exhaustion started to match the emotional weight he was carrying. He ended up in the hydroponics bay, alone because it was off-cycle and no one else needed to be here. The humid air pressed against his skin. The smell of growing things filled his lungs. He sank down among the tomato vines, back against the planting bed, and finally let himself feel everything he'd been holding at careful distance. Anger. At the council for creating systems that turned people into resources. At himself for complying when he'd sworn he wouldn't. At the ship for falling and never quite resolving into anything that felt like solid ground. Grief. For the boundary between choice and coercion that had eroded so completely he couldn't find it anymore. For the version of himself that had thought resistance mattered. For the autonomy he'd bargained away piece by negotiated piece. Exhaustion, deep and cellular and absolute. The kind that sleep wouldn't fix because it came from carrying weight that had no end point, no resolution, just endless future months of compliance stretching toward a horizon he couldn't see. He didn't notice Maren until she was sitting beside him, careful not to touch, her presence quiet and patient in the green-filtered darkness. "How did you know I was here?" he asked. "I know you. You know where I go when systems fail. That's not the same thing." "Isn't it?" Kyle looked at her, saw the exhaustion that matched his own. The weight she carried from being the bridge between survival and humanity, from fighting for terms and negotiating protocols, and trying to minimize damage when damage was inevitable. "I can't do this for years," he said. "I know. The council won't let me stop. I know that too. Then what's the point of negotiated terms? What's the point of pretending I have any choice when the only real choice is between different kinds of surrender?" Maren was quiet for a long time. Her hand moved toward his, stopped, retreated. She wanted to offer comfort through contact, but recognized that touch right now might feel like one more thing asking him to give what he didn't have left to give. "The point," she said finally, "is that even inside systems that treat us as resources, we can choose how we carry the weight. We can choose whether to carry it alone or together. We can choose whether surrender looks like capitulation or just adaptation to circumstances we can't change. That's semantics. Maybe. But semantics matter when they're all we have." Kyle reached for a tomato plant, ran his fingers over the leaves, felt the living warmth of chlorophyll and growth. These plants didn't choose to grow in artificial light, didn't choose to be cultivated and harvested and consumed. They just grew because that's what plants did. They adapted to the circumstances they were given and kept reaching toward whatever light was available. Maybe that was all any of them could do. Keep growing, keep adapting, keep reaching toward whatever small autonomies remained, even inside systems designed to extract value from their existence. "I don't want to adapt to this," he said. "I know, but I will. Eventually. Probably. And that terrifies me more than the extractions themselves." Maren's hand found his finally, their fingers interlacing carefully among the tomato vines. Her palm was warm, solid, real in a way that felt grounding after hours of floating through his own dissolution. "Then be terrified," she said, "but don't be terrified alone." They sat like that until the shift cycle changed and the hydroponics bay lights brightened for daytime simulation. Then they helped each other up, brushed soil from their clothes, and went back to the work of surviving another day on a falling ship where survival was the only moral imperative, and choosing how to carry the weight was the last small freedom they had left. 6 months, 18 weeks. 6 extractions. 6 surrenders that Kyle kept telling himself were different from capitulation, even though the distinction had worn so thin he could barely see it anymore. Doctor. Chen's stress indicators continued rising. Not dangerous yet, she said, but trending concerning. She increased monitoring frequency, added psychological evaluations to the protocol, suggested, carefully, professionally, that Kyle might benefit from talking to someone about the emotional impact of systematic extraction. He didn't. Talking wouldn't change the reality that his body had become public resource, that the boundary between person and biological material had eroded beyond recovery. But he did start spending more time with people who understood what carrying that reality looked like. Orin, in the deep spin maintenance compartments where they worked side by side in comfortable silence, their coordination unconscious after months of shared labor. Marin in the hydroponics bay, where they tended plants and shared meals and existed together, in the green filtered spaces that felt almost private despite being technically communal. The other engineers at crew meals, where Kale had started sitting regularly, letting their technical conversations wash over him like white noise that drowned out harder thoughts. Slowly, without meaning to, he built something that looked almost like community. Not friendship exactly. Friendship required vulnerability he didn't have energy for, but connection, recognition, the particular understanding that came from sharing impossible weights with people who knew what impossible weights felt like. It was after the 7th extraction that things shifted. Kyle returned to his quarters, exhausted and hollow, and needing to not be alone, but not having energy for conversation. He pulled up his comm terminal, stared at the contact list, found himself selecting Marin's code before consciously deciding to. The message was simple. Are you awake? Her response came almost immediately. Yes. Do you need company? Maybe. I'll be there in 10 minutes. She arrived in 8, still wearing sleep clothes, hair loose around her shoulders in a way he'd never seen before. She looked softer like this, more human, less like a council liaison, and more like someone who existed outside the protocols they both served. Are you okay? She asked. Define okay. Are you breathing? Upright? Not actively dying? Then I'm okay. Marin smiled sadly. She moved into his quarters without asking permission, settling onto the sleeping berth with the ease of someone comfortable in small spaces. Kyle sat beside her, maintaining careful distance, aware of her warmth and proximity in ways that made his exhaustion feel slightly less absolute. Dr. Chen sent me your latest evaluation, she said. I'm sure she did. Your stress levels are still elevated. That happens when people systematically extract pieces of you. Kale, I don't want to talk about the protocol. Then what do you want to talk about? I don't know. Anything else? Everything else. I just need to think about something that isn't compliance or extraction or the slow erosion of whatever boundaries I thought were absolute. Marin was quiet for a moment. Then she shifted closer, close enough that their shoulders touched, and the contact felt grounding in a way he desperately needed. Tell me about before, she said. Before the protocol. Before the council started watching you. What was it like? Kyle tried to remember. Tried to find the version of himself that had existed before genetic adaptation became political commodity, before his body belonged to anyone except himself. Easier, he said finally. Not easy. The ship was still falling. People were still dying from genetic degradation. But it felt like a problem we were all facing together, instead of something they needed me to solve. You weren't responsible for survival. I was just another person surviving. That must have been nice. It was normal, which is different from nice, but sometimes normal is enough. Marin's hand found his, their fingers interlacing with the practiced ease of repeated contact. This had become habit over the months, holding hands in the hydroponics bay, brief touches during crew meals, the small physical connections that said, I see you, I'm here, you're not alone without requiring words. But tonight it felt different. Tonight, the contact carried weight beyond simple comfort. Can I tell you something? Marin asked quietly. You can tell me anything. I think about leaving sometimes. The council, I mean. Just resigning. Letting someone else bridge the gap between protocols and people. Kale looked at her, saw the exhaustion etched into her features, the weight she carried from making impossible decisions and enforcing policies she didn't fully believe in. Why don't you? Because if I leave, they'll replace me with someone who doesn't fight for negotiated terms. Someone who sees people as resources without complicating it with ethics or empathy. So you stay. So I stay. They sat in silence, shoulders pressed together, hands interlaced, both trapped in systems they hadn't designed and couldn't escape. Outside Kyle's quarters, the ship hummed. The gas giant rotated. Everything kept falling in slow, inevitable descent toward resolution or annihilation. "I'm tired," Marin said eventually. "Not sleepy tired. Just tired of carrying this." "I know. Do you think it gets easier?" "No, but we get better at carrying it." Marin laughed, soft, sad, real. "You're quoting Orin. He knows what he's talking about." "Unfortunately." She leaned her head against Cale's shoulder. He let her, feeling the weight of her exhaustion pressing into him, matching his own. They stayed like that until the artificial night cycle deepened, and Marin's breathing evened into something close to sleep. Cale didn't move, didn't want to disturb her, didn't want to lose the grounding presence of another person who understood what it meant to survive inside systems that treated survival as the only morality. Eventually, she woke, pulled back with sleepy confusion, realized where she was, started to apologize. "Don't," Kyle said. "You can stay if you want." "On your sleeping berth? Where else?" Marin studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded, kicked off her shoes and settled back against the wall with careful distance that still left them close enough to feel each other's warmth. They talked quietly until actual sleep came, about small things, meaningless things, anything except protocols and extractions and the weight they both carried. And when sleep finally took them, they slept side by side like survivors in a lifeboat, holding on to whatever small comforts remained, while the ship kept falling and falling and falling towards something neither of them could see clearly enough to fear or hope for properly. The council session was called without warning. "Emergency procedure," Marin's message said. "Immediate attendance required." Kyle knew before entering the chambers that something had changed. The air felt different, charged with the particular tension that came before systemic shifts. All 7 council members were present. Varys sat at the head of the table, her expression grave. The other members wouldn't meet Kyle's eyes. "Thank you for coming," Varys said. "Please sit." Kyle remained standing. Varys sighed. "We've received new population projections. The genetic degradation is accelerating faster than predicted. Current protocol compliance rates aren't sufficient to prevent collapse within 3 generations. What does that mean? It means we're expanding the protocol. Mandatory participation for all genetically viable individuals between ages 18 and 45. No exceptions." The words landed like physical impact. Kyle felt something inside him crack, the last small boundary between his situation and everyone else's. The distinction that had made compliance feel like negotiated choice instead of systemic inevitability. "You're making it universal," he said quietly. "We don't have a choice, the numbers are clear. Everyone has a choice. You're just deciding that survival justifies removing it." Varys' expression hardened. "We're deciding that watching the human species end because we valued individual autonomy over collective survival would be the greater moral failure." Kyle looked around the table, saw council members nodding, saw the calculations in their eyes, the cold mathematics that turned people into variables in survival equations, saw Marin sitting at the far end, looking like she was about to be sick. "Marin," he said, "you voted for this." She didn't answer. Didn't need to. Her presence at the table was answer enough. "When does it start?" Kyle asked. "Immediately. We're issuing notices tonight. First mandatory extractions begin next week." "And resistance?" "Will be met with protective custody. We can't afford defection when compliance is no longer optional." Kyle turned to leave. Varys called after him. "Kyle, you were right." He stopped at the doorway. "Your resistance," Varys continued, "your insistence on negotiated terms, it established precedent. Everyone being brought into mandatory protocol will have the same rights you fought for. Medical oversight, psychological support, autonomy over implementation within required compliance. Is that supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to make you understand that your fight mattered, even though you lost." Kyle left without responding. He walked through corridors filling with people reading emergency notices on their terminals. saw shock registering on familiar faces, heard arguments starting, voices raised in anger or fear or desperate negotiation. The protocol had stopped being something that happened to genetic outliers. It was now something that happened to everyone. He found Marin in the hydroponics bay, sitting among the tomato vines with her head in her hands. She looked up when he approached, eyes red from crying. "I tried to stop it," she said. "I argued for voluntary compliance, for incentives instead of mandates. I lost. You were outvoted. I should have fought harder." Kyle sat beside her. They didn't touch. The space between them felt too charged with everything that had changed. "You knew this was coming," he said. "Suspecting isn't the same as knowing. And now I'm complicit in forcing everyone through what you've been surviving for months. Now I get to watch people I care about lose the last small autonomy they had left. Now I get to be the face of a system I don't fully believe in. You could resign and let them replace me with someone who doesn't care about minimizing damage. You're staying. I'm staying." They sat in silence while the ship hummed and the hydroponics lights simulated afternoon sun, and everything that had felt marginally stable shifted into new configurations of impossible choices. "I don't forgive you," Kyle said eventually. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I understand why you stayed." Marin looked at him, saw recognition there, someone else who understood what it meant to make terrible choices inside systems that only offered terrible options. "What now?" she asked. "Now we survive it. All of us. Together. You don't have to include me in your we." "I know, but I am anyway." Marin's hand found his among the tomato vines. He let her hold it, felt the warmth of her skin, the slight tremor that betrayed emotions she couldn't quite control. They stayed like that until the emergency notifications finished broadcasting and the ship's population began adapting to their new reality. One mandatory extraction at a time, one negotiated surrender at a time, one small erosion of autonomy at a time, until the distinction between compliance and capitulation stopped mattering, and survival became the only measure of success that anyone could afford to recognize. The first wave of mandatory extractions began a week later. Section 4 Medical expanded operations, adding 3 additional rooms and recruiting more technicians. Dr. Chen supervised training, ensuring everyone understood negotiated terms and psychological support protocols. The ship's atmosphere changed. Anger, resentment, fear. People who'd been spectators to Kale's resistance now faced the same impossible choice he'd faced: comply with terms you can survive or resist and face protective custody. Most complied. A few resisted. Those who resisted discovered that protective custody looked exactly like Kale had warned: supervised quarters, restricted movement, daily instead of monthly extractions until they agreed to terms. Resistance collapsed within 2 weeks. Kale watched it happen with something between vindication and grief. He'd been right. The protocol had always been heading toward mandatory compliance. His early resistance hadn't stopped it, just delayed it. Given people a few extra months of autonomy before the system consumed that too. But the negotiated terms had stuck. Every person entering the protocol received medical oversight, psychological support, the right to refuse dangerous procedures. Small protections that Marin had fought for, that Kale had established precedent for, that now shielded an entire population from the worst aspects of systematic extraction. It wasn't victory, but it was harm reduction. And on a falling ship, harm reduction was sometimes the closest thing to success anyone could achieve. Orin found him in the observation bay 3 weeks into universal protocol implementation. "You were right," Orin said without preamble. "About what?" "The distinction between voluntary and mandatory. It never really existed. We were all just waiting for the system to stop pretending." Kyle looked at his reflection in the viewport glass, translucent, ghostly, falling alongside everyone else now, instead of falling alone. "Does it help?" he asked. "Knowing you're not alone in it?" "Yes and no. Yes, because shared weight is lighter, Ed. No, because now I watch people I care about go through what I've been surviving and I can't protect them from it. You couldn't have protected them anyway. Knowing that doesn't make it feel less like failure." They stood in parallel silence, watching the gas giant's eternal rotation, both carrying weight that had shifted from individual to collective, but somehow felt just as heavy. "Maren's struggling," Orin said eventually. "I know. You still talking to her?" "Sometimes. She needs more than sometimes." Kyle turned to look at him. "You want me to comfort the person who voted to make this mandatory? I want you to recognize that she's carrying impossible weight, same as you. That her choices were between bad and worse, not between right and wrong. That survival makes us all complicit in systems we hate. That's not comfort. No. But it's truth. And sometimes truth is all we have." Kale thought about Maren sitting among tomato vines, crying because she'd been outvoted. Thought about her fighting for negotiated terms, even though she knew the protocol would become mandatory. Thought about her staying in a role she hated, because leaving would mean someone worse taking her place. "She made her choice," Kyle said, "and you made yours, and I made mine. And none of our choices were really choices, because the ship is falling and survival doesn't care about our moral purity. You're defending her. I'm defending all of us, because we're all just trying to survive the best we can with the terrible options we're given." Orin's hand settled on Kale's shoulder, warm, solid, grounding. Contact that asked nothing and offered only the reminder that they weren't alone in carrying this. "Go talk to her," Orin said. "Not because she deserves comfort, because you both deserve to not carry your weight alone." He left before Kale could argue. Kale stood at the viewport for another hour, watching amber and rust bands swirl through alien atmosphere, thinking about choice and complicity and the particular mathematics of survival that turned everyone into something slightly less than they'd hoped to be. Then he went to find Maren. Maren wasn't in her quarters, wasn't in the council chambers, wasn't anywhere obvious. Kyle found her in the deep spin maintenance sublevel, sitting in the same place he'd sat months ago when Orin had told him that compliance was survivable but never quite acceptable. She looked small in the dim lighting, exhausted in ways that went beyond physical tiredness. "How did you know I'd be here?" she asked. "Because I know where you go when systems fail." A smile flickered across her face, brief, sad, real. "I used that line on you." "I remember." Kyle sat beside her, maintaining careful distance even though what he wanted was to pull her close and remind them both that being human was still possible inside systems that treated them as resources. "I've been thinking about resigning," Maren said quietly. "Again? Seriously this time. I can't keep being the face of mandatory compliance. Can't keep enforcing protocols I don't believe in. Can't keep watching people suffer through systematic extraction and pretending it's justified by survival mathematics. If you resign, they'll replace you. I know. With someone worse? Probably. So why are you considering it?" Myron turned to face him, eyes bright with exhaustion or tears or both. "Because staying is making me into someone I don't recognize. Someone who votes for mandatory protocols and enforces compliance and tells herself that harm reduction matters, when what I'm really doing is enabling harm with better documentation. Harm reduction does matter. Does it? Or is that just what we tell ourselves so we can sleep at night?" Kyle didn't have an answer. Didn't know if harm reduction was meaningful resistance or just comfortable complicity. Didn't know if the negotiated terms he'd fought for actually protected people or just made their violation feel more palatable. "I don't know," he said finally. "But I know that when I was facing protective custody, you fought for terms that gave me back some measure of autonomy. I know that every person in mandatory protocol has rights because you insisted they should. I know that matters even when it doesn't feel like it matters." Maren's hand found his. Their fingers interlaced with practiced ease, the contact grounding them both. "I'm so tired," she whispered, "of carrying this, of being complicit, of surviving inside systems that make survival feel like slow death." "I know. Do you hate me?" "For voting, yes." Kyle thought about that, thought about anger and resentment and the particular betrayal of watching someone you'd started to trust become instrument of the system that hurt you. Thought about Myron crying among tomato vines. Thought about her fighting for terms when she knew they wouldn't stop the protocol from becoming mandatory. Thought about her staying in a role she hated because leaving would make things worse. "No," he said, "I don't hate you. I'm angry that you voted yes. I'm hurt that you didn't find a way to stop it. But I don't hate you, because I understand what it's like to make impossible choices and have to live with them afterward." Maren's eyes filled with tears. She didn't try to hide them. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know that doesn't change anything. I know I'm still complicit, but I'm sorry anyway." Kyle pulled her close. She came without resistance, pressing her face against his shoulder, while months of exhaustion and guilt and impossible wait finally broke through whatever professional distance she'd been maintaining. He held her while she cried, felt her body shake with sobs she'd been holding back too long, felt his own throat tighten with emotions he didn't have names for, anger and compassion and grief and something that might have been forgiveness or might just have been recognition that they were both drowning in systems neither had designed. When the tears finally stopped, Maren pulled back slightly, not quite leaving his arms. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "Not hating me. Holding me. Understanding that I'm trying my best even when my best is terrible. We're all trying our best. It just turns out that our best looks a lot like compromise and capitulation and slow erosion of the principles we thought were absolute. That's depressing. That's survival." Maren laughed, wet, exhausted, real. Then she settled more comfortably against him, head on his shoulder, their bodies finding equilibrium in the artificial gravity. They stayed like that for a long time. Not talking, just existing together in the space between systems, in the brief respite where they could be human to each other instead of protocol participants and council liaisons and resources being systematically extracted. "I'm not going to resign," Maren said eventually. "I know. But I need you to know that I hate what I'm doing, that I see the harm I'm enabling, that I'm choosing to stay only because leaving would make it worse. I know that too. And you're okay with it? I'm okay with you. The system you're part of, I'll never be okay with that. But you, I can live with." Maren turned her head to look at him, their faces close enough that he could feel her breath against his skin. "Can I kiss you?" she asked quietly. The question hung between them, weighted with everything they'd survived together, everything that made intimacy complicated by power dynamics and complicity and the particular impossibility of connection inside systems designed to extract rather than nurture. "Yes," Kyle said. She kissed him softly, carefully, like she was asking permission with every second of contact. Kyle kissed her back, feeling months of tension and anger and exhaustion and need collapse into this single point of connection. When they finally pulled apart, they stayed close, foreheads pressed together, breathing each other's air. "This doesn't fix anything," Maren said. "I know. We're still trapped in systems that hurt us. I know that too. But it helps. Being together. Carrying this together instead of alone. Yes. It helps." They held each other in the deep spin maintenance sublevel while the ship hummed and the gas giant rotated and everything kept falling toward resolution that might take centuries to arrive. But for now, for this moment, they had each other. And on a falling ship that was enough. 9 months, 36 weeks, 9 extractions for Kyle. Universal mandatory protocol for everyone else. The ship's population adapted to their new reality with the same stubborn resilience humans had always shown when survival demanded compromise. The anger faded into routine. The resistance collapsed into compliance. The distinction between choice and coercion blurred until most people stopped looking for it. Kyle kept working, kept maintaining systems, kept moving through gravity shifts with unconscious grace, while his body was systematically extracted and distributed and turned into genetic material for a population that might survive another 3 generations if the projections held. But something had shifted. The weight felt different now, lighter somehow, even though nothing objective had changed. He was in the hydroponics bay when he finally understood why. Maren worked beside him, hands in soil, tending the tomato vines that kept growing despite artificial light and recycled water and the constant awareness that they existed only to be consumed. She looked tired but steady, carrying her weight with the practiced endurance of someone who'd learned to survive the impossible. Orin was there too, helping with the harvest, his movements efficient and familiar. He caught Kyle's eye and smiled. Brief acknowledgement of shared understanding, shared weight, shared survival. Around them, other crew members worked. Some Kyle knew well, some he'd only seen in passing. All of them protocol participants now, all of them carrying the same weight Kyle had carried alone for months. And that was the difference. The weight was the same. The system was the same. The systematic extraction and conversion of bodies into resources was the same. But Cale wasn't carrying it alone anymore. "You're thinking hard again," Merrin said, not looking up from the vines. "Someone has to. It doesn't have to be you. It never did. I just thought it did." Merrin glanced at him, understanding flickering in her expression. She set down her pruning shears and moved closer, her hand finding his among the green growth. "You've changed," she said quietly. "Have I? You're here, working with people instead of avoiding them, letting us carry weight with you instead of insisting you can carry it alone. The weight got too heavy, or you got tired of pretending you could carry it yourself." Cale thought about that, thought about 9 months of extractions and compliance and slow erosion of boundaries he'd thought were absolute, thought about learning that survival looked like compromise and capitulation and accepting help from people who were as trapped as he was. "Maybe both," he said. Merrin squeezed his hand. Then she returned to the vines, working in comfortable parallel rhythm that came from months of shared labor. Kyle finished the section he was working on and moved to where Orin was harvesting near the back wall. They worked without speaking, their coordination unconscious and practiced. "You doing okay?" Orin asked eventually. "Most days." Orin smiled. "That's all any of us get." "I know. I'm learning to be okay with that." "Good. Because it doesn't get easier, but we get better at carrying it." "Exactly." They continued harvesting until the shift cycle changed and the hydroponics bay lights dimmed to simulate evening. People began drifting toward their quarters, toward crew meals, toward whatever small comforts they'd found in a life of mandatory protocols and systematic extraction. Kyle stayed. Merrin stayed. Orin stayed. They sat among the tomato vines, shoulders touching, hands occasionally finding each other, existing in the quiet space between survival and resistance. "I've been thinking," Myron said, "about what comes next." "There is no next," Kyle said. "There's just this, falling and working and extracting and surviving. That's not a life. It's the life we have, but it doesn't have to be only that. We can still choose small things, where we sit at crew meals, who we spend time with, how we carry the weight together instead of alone." Orin shifted closer, his presence solid and grounding. "She's right. The big choices are gone, but the small ones, those we still have." Cale looked at them both, saw the exhaustion they carried, saw the compromises they'd made, saw the stubborn persistence that kept them human inside systems designed to reduce them to resources, saw people he'd learned to trust despite everything. "Okay," he said, "then I choose this. Sitting here with you, carrying this together, finding whatever small autonomies remain and protecting them." "That's enough?" Merrin asked. "On a falling ship?" "Yes, that's enough." They stayed in the hydroponics bay until the night cycle deepened and the ship's hum became the only sound. Then they helped each other up, brushed soil from their clothes, and walked together through the corridors toward quarters and rest and whatever tomorrow would bring. Outside the viewports, the gas giant rotated. The ship fell. Everything kept moving in slow descent toward resolution that might take centuries to arrive. But inside, in the small spaces where humans found each other, they'd built something that felt almost like home. Not the home any of them had imagined, not the life any of them had chosen, just the stubborn persistence of connection inside systems that tried to isolate and extract and consume. It wasn't victory, it wasn't freedom, it wasn't even really choice, but it was survival, and survival carried together felt different from survival carried alone, different enough to matter, different enough to be worth the weight, different enough to keep them falling together instead of falling apart all the way down.